So this chapter covers stress, health, and coping. And so we define stress as a negative emotional state occurring in response to events perceived as taxing. So stressors are things that cause stress. And one of the best explanations for this is the cognitive appraisal model, which argues that basically your evaluation of the situation and the resources that you have to deal with the situation determine your feelings of stress. We'll talk about the fact that when our body encounters a stressor, it kind of mobilizes to fight off the stress and then restore itself to its normal function. So stress can affect emotions, thoughts, behavior, physical responses, as well as health. So this is just a graphic of the cognitive appraisal model where we have an event, my car won't start and I'm going to miss class. We have to make an appraisal. Do I have the resources? If we have the resources, there's a bus that runs right by my house, then you don't feel stress. If you don't have the resources, I'm never going to make it to class on time, you're going to experience stress. And you also go through this process of reappraisal and determining, were my resources or was my coping successful, right? If you caught the bus and you're on your way, then you're not going to feel stressed. But if you miss the last bus to campus, you may still experience stress. So there's a couple of ways in which we might experience stress. One theory is life events play a big role in our stress. So positive life events like going to college or getting married or the birth of a child, as well as negative life events like grief and work problems and poverty, all contribute to stress. And the life events theory really argues that any change, be it positive or negative in life, leads to stress. There's somewhat mixed evidence for this theory, and it actually shows that some of those big events that we expect to have a huge impact on our stress levels actually don't have hugely long-term impacts. Things like the loss of a job and things like that might lead to a negative slight decrease in happiness, but overall they don't have a huge effect. So a couple of other things or sources of stress, traumatic events. So these are kind of a special type of life events that go far beyond the normal experience. So this is witnessing or surviving a violent attack, warfare, some kind of major disaster. Some people experience post-traumatic stress disorder during these times, but most people do recover even from traumatic events. One of the things that we see most associated with stress is daily hassles. So daily hassles are everyday occurrences. These are things that are annoying and stressful. So I've got some examples that you might have experienced. So concerns about weight, not enough money for housing, losing things, interruptions, specific to college students, things like wasting time, worry about your future, computer problems, things like that. And what we find is the frequency of these daily hassles is linked to mental and physical health. It's associated with unhealthy behaviors and poorer well-being. These tend to be cumulative, so each one is kind of minor and unimportant, but they add up. And sometimes we see burnout associated specifically with work stress, where people feel exhausted, they've used all of their resources and don't feel like they're effectively coping. Sometimes we also see social and cultural stress where people living under difficult conditions like crime or poverty or crowding experience chronic stress. Now, generally, we think that stress is bad, but there's some evidence for resilience, which is basically the idea that the ability to cope with stress and adversity and being able to rebound after negative experiences. This figure actually shows that there's some evidence that a little bit of lifetime adversity is actually better. So on the left side, those who have no lifetime adversity have less satisfaction and higher distress. But if you go to the right, the people on the very high end of life adversity also have very high levels of these negative things. And it's actually the people in the middle who've experienced a little bit of adversity who are doing the best. Okay, so there are actually physical changes in our body when we experience stress. So Cannon was the first person to kind of identify this, and he noticed that The fight or flight response is influenced by the sympathetic nervous system and the endocrine system. So stress hormones like catecholamines or adrenaline lead to physical changes associated with the fight or flight response. Your heart beats fast, sweating, things like that. It's okay in the short term, but is really negative in the long term. So this general adaptation syndrome looks at what happens to rats when they have prolonged periods of stress, and they experience enlarged adrenal glands, stomach ulcers, weight loss, and a shrinking immune system. So what we see is they go through 3 phases. The alarm phase is when that sympathetic nervous system kicks in. The resistance phase is when our body starts to adapt. There's less physiological arousal, but we're not as good as dealing with the new stressor if we're still coping with the previous stressor. And then eventually, if the stressor is still present, we experience exhaustion, where the symptoms of the alarm stage become kind of irreversible and your body starts to break down and see negative effects. One of the negative physical effects of stress we see actually in your DNA. So telomeres are repeated DNA sequences at the tips of chromosomes. Telomerase is an enzyme that can help repair, so it adds DNAs to the shortened telomeres. Basically, what we find is that individuals who are under chronic stress, who are, for example, caring for chronically ill children, when they experience a stressor, those who are under chronic stress have a less positive response to that stressor and more negative impact over time. So basically, their bodies aren't able to rebound if you're under chronic stress compared to individuals who are low in stress. So stress also influences our immune system. So our immune system produces specialized white blood cells that protect the body from viruses, bacteria, and tumor cells. Psychoneuroimmunology was a field that was developed. Originally, we thought that the immune system was completely independent from our psychological well-being, but we know it's linked to the central nervous system and does actually have a big impact. So there's significant evidence that our immune function is linked to stress. And interpersonal stress can lead to risks for health problems. Stress increases how long it takes for a wound to heal. People who are under high stress are more susceptible to the cold virus. And so there's a lot of evidence that our stress levels can have an impact on our immune system. There are also psychological factors associated with stress. So personal control. So when we experience a situation as out of our control, we're more likely to feel stressed by it because we feel like we don't have the resources with it, the resources to deal with it. Our explanatory style, whether we see the world optimistically. So if we make these kind of external and unstable and specific attributions for negative events, it's associated with more positive health. In contrast to a more pessimistic view where you make internal, stable, and global explanations for negative events. So you give up after rejection. We also know that having more negative emotions increases stress and is worse for health, and fewer positive emotions. So people who actually have more positive emotions show increased resistance to infection, decreased illness, and less pain. So a number of good outcomes. Another psychological factor is the illusion of control. So when we feel in control, our life seems less hectic and problem-filled, which leads to less stress. In the situations where we don't have control, there are also situations where we don't have control and we think we do. So this kind of gets at this active versus passive participation. So in active participation, we are making a decision that makes us feel like we have control, even if we don't actually. So an example of this is like gambling or playing the lottery. So if you play the lottery and you pick your lottery number, you are actively participating, which makes you feel like you have more control over the situation compared to people who just have the machine pick random numbers, which is passive participation. They believe they're less likely to win. Another factor that influences influences stress is personality. We've talked about kind of ways that we can break down personality, but one of them is kind of type A versus type B personality. So this research was looking specifically at heart disease. So we know that chronic stress can lead to an overstimulation of the sympathetic nervous system, which can lead to high blood pressure. What we find is that people who have a type A behavior pattern are twice as likely to develop heart disease as type B. So that type A behaviors, a sense of time urgency, so they're always in a hurry, hostility, and competitiveness, whereas people who are classified as type B are more relaxed and easygoing and non-competitive. It seems to be specifically the hostility in the type A personality that's associated with greater heart disease, because hostile people react more intensely to a stressor, and this leads to the creation of more stress. Now, it's important to note that these studies are all correlational, so we're not sure of the causal relationship, but there is a significant amount of research showing this link between hostility and heart disease. Social factors can also influence it. So we know that people with fewer social connections are more likely to die. They have poorer mental and physical health. And on the flip side, people with more diverse social network have more benefits. So social support is really important. It can help people cope with a stressor. So it'll help them modify their appraisal of a stressor. So having, someone to give you a ride if your car breaks down makes it that less of a stressor for you because you have resources to deal with it. They can help you physically, so just the presence of another person is calming, and generally when we are with other people, we have fewer negative emotions and more positive emotions. Now, it's important to note that relationships can cause stress, right? So if people have marital conflict, it can have a negative impact on their physical health. But in general, social factors can decrease stress. So in terms of how we manage stress, we do this through coping. And so coping are efforts to change circumstances, interpretation of circumstances, to help us view them as more favorable and less threatening. So in order for our coping to be adaptive, we have to switch strategies and evaluate kind of how effective our efforts have been. Did it work? Do we need to switch? And so adaptive coping is dynamic, it's flexible. In contrast, maladaptive coping is thoughts and behaviors that intensify and prolong distress and produce self-defeating outcomes. So two general kind of categories of coping are problem-focused and emotion-focused coping. So problem-focused coping is focusing on managing or changing the stressor, which is more effective when you actually have control over the circumstances. So planful problem-solving coping is rationally analyzing the situation, identifying a solution, and implementing it. Confrontive coping is more kind of direct and assertive. Sometimes this kind of edges on angry and hostile. And finally, emotion-focused coping is about relieving or regulating emotional impact of the stressor. This is about kind of, even when we can't control the situation, we can control our emotions about the situation. So sometimes you see escape avoidance, shifting our attention away from the stressor towards other activities, be it sleep or cleaning or drugs or alcohol. And this often offers kind of short-term relief, but isn't necessarily super effective long-term. Seeking social support, so turning to others to help us with emotional or tangible or informational support can be beneficial. Distancing, so acknowledging kind of that there's a problem, but minimizing the impact. Well, I have a test coming up, but it's only a small portion of my grade. Or denial, refusing to acknowledge the problem, which is really bad if it requires immediate response. Positive reappraisal is a really good one. This is generally the most constructive, and it's about minimizing the negative emotional aspects and creative positive meaning or personal growth. So this situation is really hard right now, but here's what I'm going to learn from it. There's also religious coping that can be either positive or negative. So positive religious coping is things like seeking comfort in prayer or the religious community, whereas negative religious coping would be things like being angry with God or questioning your religious beliefs, believing you're being punished. So there's no single best strategy in terms of coping. There's no one size fits all. It depends on the problem. It depends on the individual. But really the most effective coping strategy is one that's flexible and changes with the problem and your own mental state. Oops. Sorry, and that is it.